Okay, so today we're diving deep, really deep into Alice Walker's The Color Purple. We're going to try to unlock some of the deeper meaning and significance within this powerful novel. And to help guide our deep dive, we're going to be looking closely at some insights from Dr. Jasmant Rathade's discussion of the book.
Yeah, The Color Purple is one of those books that just stays with you long after you finish it, right?
Yeah.
And Dr. Rathod, he really unpacks the book's complexity beautifully, highlighting those core themes that Walker so masterfully weaves together.
And what are some of those big themes that we'll be exploring today?
Well, Dr. Rathod points to three major themes that we're going to try to unpack. Um, Racism, identity, and religion. He argues that these themes are absolutely crucial to understanding the characters' lives, their relationships, and really the novel's overall impact.
And especially, I imagine, within the very specific context of the setting.
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about The Color Purple without acknowledging the huge impact of the setting, right? We're talking for the Jim Crow South in the early 20th century, a time and place marked by just intense racial segregation and deeply ingrained prejudice.
Right, and Dr. Rathod really emphasizes how that backdrop of systemic racism that really becomes a character in itself almost, right? It shapes everything.
For sure. And it's not just like this abstract concept in the background. Walker brings that racism to life through the very concrete, very lived experiences of her characters,
Yeah.
especially Celie, the protagonist.
Let's talk about Celie then, because Dr. Rathod really uses her journey to eliminate the devastating impact of racism on individuals.
Totally. And it's heartbreaking. Celie's life from the very beginning is just marked by poverty and abuse.
And it's not just abuse from like white individuals, which of course is a huge part of the story, but
It's more insidious than that, isn't it?
right.
It comes from within her own community as well.
But even within her own family, tragically.
No. Exactly. And for me, one of the most gut-wrenching moments is when Celie witnesses the lynching, the one her father committed. It leaves this indelible scar on her psyche.
It really underscores the constant threat of violence that hung over Black lives in that era.
It's this ever-present terror. And all of these experiences, they just chip away at Celie's sense of self-worth. And then you add the layer of domestic violence she endures. It's just layer upon layer of trauma and degradation that reinforces this horrible feeling of inferiority that's imposed upon her.
But then we have Shug Avery. Now she's like this burst of vibrant energy and defiance, right?
Shug. She's incredible. She's like this force of nature. And Dr. Rathod really sees her as a symbol of resistance against those very forces that are trying to crush Celie.
She's a brazen hussy, as she's often called in the novel, right? But she's also incredibly talented, accomplished, a renowned blues singer.
And her confidence, her refusal to conform to those narrow societal expectations, it's incredibly empowering, especially for Celie, who's been so beaten down by life.
So how does Shug really embody this idea of resistance against the racism of the Jim Crow South?
Well, in a lot of ways. She's challenging the very limited roles that society tries to impose on Black women.
Right, because during this time, being a Black woman meant being relegated to the margins of society?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Shug, she just refuses to be marginalized.
Yeah.
She embraces his sexuality. She defies those traditional gender roles. She's forging her own path.
And by doing so, she becomes a powerful example of, like you said, agency and empowerment, right?
Right. Even in the face of those incredibly oppressive circumstances.
But racism, as we see in the novel, it's not just an external force.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Dr. Rathod talks a lot about this concept of internalized racism. It's this insidious process by which individuals start to believe the negative stereotypes that society perpetuates about them.
And we see this most clearly, I think, in both Celie and Sophia's characters.
Yeah. They've both, in different ways, internalized this toxic message that their lives are less valuable, less worthy.
And this manifests in how they accept abuse, how they silence their own voices.
Right. It becomes this vicious cycle. And I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of the novel. How Walker shows the insidious ways in which oppression becomes deeply embedded within the very psyches of the oppressed.
Okay, so to sort of sum up our discussion of racism in The Color Purple, it's more than just a setting, right?
It's the very air the characters breathe.
It's the foundation upon which everything else is built. The novel really forces us to confront the brutal realities of racial discrimination, how it seeps into the character's sense of self, and ultimately how they navigate those treacherous waters in their search for equality and justice.
And I think that search for justice really ties into our next theme, which is identity.
And it's impossible to talk about identity in the novel without talking about Celie's incredible transformation, right?
Oh, totally. And Dr. Rathod frames this transformation as a journey of self-discovery. She starts out so deeply wounded, so convinced of her own worthlessness.
And where does that sense of worthlessness come from, do you think?
Well, I think it's a combination of everything we've talked about so far.
Hmm.
The racism, the abuse, the constant messages from society telling her that she's less than.
And how does she start to break free from those deeply ingrained beliefs?
I think the relationships she forms with other women, especially with Shug Avery, are absolutely critical. They create this space for her to start questioning those beliefs that have been imposed upon her.
And it's interesting, isn't it, how Shug, who's kind of like this embodiment of self-creation, becomes this catalyst for Celie's own self-discovery.
Right. It's like Shug shows Celie that it's possible to define yourself on your own terms, even in a society that's trying to put you in a box.
So Shug is sort of modeling this idea of radical self-acceptance, and it's not just about rejecting societal expectations, it's about actively creating an identity that feels authentic and true to herself.
Right. And I think that really resonates with Celie, who's spent so much of her life trying to conform to what others expect of her.
And you can't talk about identity in The Color Purple without talking about the intersection of race and gender, right?
Right. Absolutely. As Dr. Ethel points out, the Black women in this novel, they're facing this double burden of oppression. It's not just about being Black, and it's not just about being a woman. It's about how those two identities intersect and create these unique challenges.
And how does that intersection specifically impact the way these women see themselves and navigate the world?
I think it shapes their entire experience, right? It influences how they're perceived by others, how they're treated. It limits their opportunities. And it can make it so much harder to forge a strong sense of self when you're constantly being told in subtle and not so subtle ways that you're less than.
And then we have Sophia, who from the very beginning seems to have this incredibly strong sense of self, this unshakable core.
Oh, Sophia is amazing. She's like this embodiment of strength and resilience.
And she absolutely refuses to play by society's rules. She won't be submissive. She won't back down.
And that's so powerful, right? Because she's directly challenging those power dynamics that try to keep women, especially Black women, in a subordinate position.
Right. And Dr. Rathod highlights how Sophia becomes the symbol of the inherent strength and resilience of Black women, how even in the face of immense adversity, they refuse to be broken.
And that's such an important message, I think, especially for Celie, who's still on that journey of discovering her own strength.
So when we look at identity in The Color Purple, we see these different paths, right? Celie's gradual self-discovery, Shug's defiant self-creation, and Sophia's unwavering sense of self. And it all plays out against this backdrop of racial and gender oppression.
And it makes you think, what does it really take to forge a strong, authentic identity in a world that's constantly trying to define you?
It's a question that resonates even today.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about racism, we've talked about identity. What's next?
Well, next, let's turn to the theme of religion. Because, as Dr. Rathod points out, religion plays this really complex and multifaceted role in the novel.
And you can't really talk about religion in The Color Purple without talking about the cultural context, right?
Right. We're talking about the American South in the early 20th century. Religion is a huge part of life for many people.
Especially in the Black community. Church was often the center of social life. It provided a sense of community, of support.
And of course, it also had a huge impact on the way people viewed the world, their values, their morals.
Exactly. And Dr. Rathod points out that the novel explores both the positive and the negative aspects of religion.
And we see this really clearly in Celie's own journey of faith, right?
Totally. She starts out as this very devout young woman, but her experiences, the abuse, the hypocrisy she witnesses, it all starts to make her question her faith.
And the fact that her stepfather, who's a preacher, is the source of so much of her pain, that's got to be incredibly disillusioning.
It really highlights how religious institutions can be used to justify and even perpetuate oppression.
Right, and Dr. Rathod makes this point that Celie's struggles with faith force her to grapple with some really fundamental questions, like, what role should religion play in her life? And is the God she's been taught about truly a God of love and compassion?
And then we have Shug Avery, who comes in and really challenges those conventional religious beliefs, right?
Right. She's like this whirlwind of energy, and she lives life on her own terms.
Exactly. She embraces her sexuality. She doesn't conform to those rigid moral codes.
And Celie initially sees her as, like, almost sinful. But as their relationship develops, Shug starts to challenge Celie's preconceived notions about religion and morality.
And it's through Shug that Celie begins to explore a more personal and less dogmatic form of spirituality. One that's not about blind obedience or adhering to strict rules, but about connecting with something larger than herself.
And then we have Nettie's experiences in Africa, which introduce this whole other dimension of spirituality.
Right. Nettie's letters from Africa, they're so fascinating, right?
They really broaden our understanding of religion and spirituality within the novel.
Exactly. She's immersed in the Olinka tribes, beliefs, and customs. And it's so different from the Christianity that Celie's been exposed to.
And what are some of the key things that Nettie learns from the Olinka people?
Well, I think one of the most important things is the power of ancestral connections. This idea that we're all connected to those who came before us, and that our spirituality is rooted in that connection.
And that stands in stark contrast to the more individualistic focus of Western Christianity.
Totally. And I think Nettie's experiences in Africa really challenged the idea that there's only one right way to believe or to practice spirituality.
So to kind of pull together our discussion of religion in The Color Purple, it's not a simple theme, right?
Not at all. It's nuanced. It's complex.
We see how religion can be a source of both comfort and oppression. We see Celie's struggle with faith, Shug's challenge to conventional beliefs, and Nettie's exploration of African traditional beliefs. And it's all interwoven with those themes of racism and identity that we talked about earlier.
It all comes back to those core themes, doesn't it?
So for you, our listener, understanding these key themes that Dr. Rathbone has illuminated, the pervasive impact of systemic racism, the search for identity and self-acceptance, and the complexities of faith and spirituality, it really enriches the way we read and experience The Color Purple.
It allows us to connect with the characters on a deeper level, to appreciate the historical context, and to see how those same themes continue to resonate in our own lives and in society at large.
It makes you wonder, how can we, like Celie and Shug and Sophia, find our own voices and challenge the forces that try to silence us?
And how can we create a more just and equitable world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and to live authentically?
It's a question that Walker leaves us with, and it's a question that's worth pondering long after we finish the last page of The Color Purple. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Yeah, thanks for listening.